Welcome, everyone. Bill Treneer, President of International Communications Management. ICM is in the security and cybersecurity training and consulting business, so we thought we would be good to bring you a discussion about least privilege today, which is a tenet of a good security design. Now, the target audience for this panel discussion that we're going to be doing today is going to be your chief executive officers, your chief information officers, your chief technical officers, maybe even your CISO types, chief information and security officers, those people who need to make some kind of buying decision about a project they might be doing in the future here. So, but specifically, you don't need to get into all the weeds of a technical discussion. Now, trust me, we're more than happy to do a deep dive for you. We do technical discussions like that all the time, so we're happy to do that. But that's not what our target is today. We can do that at another time. So, specifically, we're going to get into access today, identity, and privilege, and security around those topics. And we're going to talk about how to get ready for them. So, the first thing I want to do is I want to introduce my panelists with me today. First of all, today we have Andrew Brorenson, who is a senior partner and founder of Cirrus Cybersecurity Group, which is an ICM Alliance partner. Andrew's consulting expertise specializes in cybersecurity and regulatory compliance. He's worked in the industries of insurance, energy, utilities, and supply chain. Andrew is also a business analyst. I wouldn't say he's a former CPA, because you're never a former CPA, right? You always have that in you, but he's done a lot of CPA stuff, as well as he's a hands-on technical expert, especially in the areas of identity, security, privileged access, and multi-factor authentication. So thank you, Andrew, for being here with us today.
Thank you, Bill.
Okay, good. Also, we have Joe Payette. Now, how do I say your last name, Joe? Did I say that, or do I say Joe Payette? What's the
Payette.
Payette. Joe Payette. Okay, good. All right. So, Joe has been in the IT field for 30 years. He is a ICM trainer and consultant. He's worked in the healthcare industry, and then he moved on to the banking industry, and he's had educational clients. He's been a certified Microsoft trainer for over 20 years, and he has specializations in Active Directory and cloud services. So got some very high-level guys. Joe, thanks for being with us here today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so the first thing that I want to get into is a little explanation of what I think of when I think of the concept of least privilege. You know, we have all of these different concepts in cybersecurity, like time to detect, and all these others. But with least privilege, I always think of that as if a hacker gets into somebody's machine, they've got control of that machine. What we don't want them to do, we want to limit that as much as possible about what they're doing. We don't want them to move laterally, sideways, and get into other people's machines and get access to everything. And one of the ways we do that is to make sure that each person that is hacked into is only limited to getting into certain servers and certain databases and certain SharePoint sites and things like that. And certain email accounts. We don't want them to be able to get into lots and lots of them, which over a long period of time being in a company, they might have been in one department and had access in that department, and been in another department, then had access in that, and still been there 5 years. They've now been in 20 different departments with 20 different servers and 20 different SharePoint sites. And if they still have all those credentials, then the hacker can get into everything. So a principle of least privilege would go a long way in kind of keeping this kind of thing under control. So that is kind of a tenet that is going to be part of what we discuss. Specifically, though, to keep that to a minimum, we're going to talk today about access, identity security, those type of projects, and how to get ready for them. So my first question here to our panel is going to go to you, Andrew. Could you describe, let's say, the business case? What would be the business case for a good identity security project, like return on investment, stuff like that?
Sure. So I think what's important to look at is in any investment in any business, particularly in something like cybersecurity, top of mind for a lot of business owners and boards and executives, you want to make sure that you're getting value for that investment. And it's basically your old-fashioned risk-reward matrix. And so when you look at something like cybersecurity, you're doing layers of defense. And one of those layers we're going to talk about today is identity security. And so the business case that you're looking at specific to that layer of defense is in two specific areas. One, it's in the compliance aspect. Many industries are regulated by some other entity, or there's compliance requirements within the industry or with the government. And so being able to effectively create the reports, work with the audit team, provide that information in a timely manner, and avoid fines and penalties from non-compliance, that's really one key business case. And the other is efficiencies. And so if you look at the number of applications and unique security permissions that are, you look at something like SAP with potentially thousands of unique permissions, you want to make sure that only, back to your least privilege, only the right access is assigned to the right people at the right time for the right purpose. And then when that authentication is no longer required or necessary for the job they're performing, you want to make sure you're efficiently, in a timely manner, removing that. And some of those tie back to compliance. Again, if you're not removing access in a timely manner, that may result in a fine or a penalty.
So what expense do companies go to say have a person at the help desk do all that? I mean, does all that help desk time has to translate into dollars at some point, right?
It does. And I think there's a lot of available metrics out there that will show you, quantity of X tickets specific to granting and removing access equals Y output. And that can be measured, and that can be turned into opportunities for efficiency. Again, looking at tools that can streamline or automate that, basically taking all that administrative time and effort, shifting it into a more controlled and an opportunity to reduce risk process allows you then to get the efficiency, but while you're doing that, be also in compliance, as well as potentially assign those resources to other opportunities within the company.
So if you were, say this was a medium to large company, say Fortune 1000 or something like that, or maybe a county or a city, are we talking $1,000 a month, tens of thousands of dollars a month, $100,000 a month? What typically would you be running into as far as costs from the help desk for something like this?
Yeah, so I think one particular example we can use where the ROI was based purely on the opportunity to look at the resource cost. There was about 250 resources working in an offshore model, and that expense was 24/7, 365. And again, just handling tens of thousands of tickets per month. And that cost of those resources were effectively what was used to justify the cost of implementing the system. And again, those resources were repurposed to more higher value help desk activities instead of the routine administrative tasks.
Okay, so it sounds like tens of thousands of dollars per month,
Tens of thousands of dollars.
Or more, right? That kind of thing.
Even in the offshore model where the costs are lower, 250 resources is still very costly.
Yeah, that's huge. That's a huge amount per month that possibly could even be automated, right? That's what we're kind of getting to at some point. We could automate a lot of that. Okay, so that's one of the good business cases. What about continuing on with you, Andrew? What about like a security case? I know it's tough to put a return on investment on security because people would say, well, I've never been hacked into, I've never had an incident, so the return on investment is zero. Or those that have been hacked, the return on investment is what, a million to one or so. I mean, so what are the? Can you speak to that a little bit? What's the security case in that situation?
Sure. So I think it ties into some of the things we've covered on the business case, but clearly in the security side of the house, what you're trying to do is take advantage of the least privileged principle, like you mentioned earlier. And what that's going to allow you to do is most forensics reports will show getting inside the organization and moving laterally to get to the privileged credential. And the privileged credential could be any of your administrators that provide access to servers, access to data, access to files. That's where all of the damage is occurring, is once you get to those privileged credentials. And so by having least privilege and controlling who has access, you have a better opportunity to manage your security profile, reduce your risk. So the way you do that is making sure, again, you only have the right access assigned to the right people at the right time. And so a lot of that is controls that are business process controls,
right,
backed up with proper tools and technology. And you can alert and open tickets to see if there's an issue and have reactions, or you can automate the just immediate shutdown of certain accounts if anomalous behavior is detected.
Exactly. So these tools you're talking about, do they, especially like those that are having in some kind of Microsoft environment, aren't most all the Microsoft environments using Active Directory pretty much?
Sure. So
do a lot of these tools, do they connect into Active Directory in some way?
Yeah. So in most shops, we see an Active Directory installation, and that's one of the first tools that we connect to. And so if you think about it, if you're going to create a central identity repository and map that to a human being using your HR system, those would be the first two things that we connect to, so that we get a picture. And that picture is going to say, look, I have, X thousand employees, and those employees have access to these particular AD groups. Those AD groups then grant you access into some endpoint behind that.
Exactly.
Once that mapping's in place, now I can provide you that picture of who has what and when did they get it, those kind of details that are available. And so then you can start working with removing access that's inappropriate and getting better control over what you have in your environment.
Okay. For those of you who may not be really familiar with Active Directory, we're going to jump over to Joe here. Joe, could you, because not everybody in this target audience is necessarily understands everything about Active Directory. So could you give us kind of a basic understanding of what Active Directory is and what it does?
Yeah, Active Directory is Microsoft's identity solution, and it's implemented on premises. It's a store of accounts, the user accounts that we're going to assign to users. And it also includes computer accounts as well. The idea behind Active Directory is everyone with an identity can then prove their identity by using, most often, a username and password, but other methods as well. And based on that identity, then we can grant or deny access to resources, which could be directories, or we could grant or deny access to databases or VPN connections. So it's their identity and access solution for on-premises.
Okay, and I understand that they've kind of copied that over into their cloud version now too, right?
Yeah, in the cloud, there's an identity solution called Azure Active Directory, or Azure AD, we call it. The two directories are quite different from one another. One is really, Azure AD is in place to support cloud-based users or access to cloud-based resources. But the principles, the underlying principles are the same, that you have an account in Azure AD, you prove your identity, and then we can grant access to resources in the cloud. And as Andrew said, the idea here, once we've identified a user, that we give them just the access that they need and no more. So that concept of least privilege is applied here in the cloud and on premises as well.
So that's an overall principle, and then we've got to, get down to the configuration of what that really means, right? So,
yeah.
So could you, you've had a little bit of experience with this. Now, what would you consider to be a good design of Active Directory to kind of get it ready for one of these identity security type projects? If you wanted to bring in these things that Andrew's talking about, what would you really need to do to get Active Directory ready?
I always believe in the simplest design is the best design. And that's not to say you wouldn't have a complex design, but you should have a good knowledge of how Active Directory works if you're going to start building in some complexity. So some of the best designs here would be to start with a single domain, which is kind of a unit of resources that we manage. And then in order to delegate administration of those resources, we can break up those resources into what we call organizational units, and we can delegate permissions in that way. You know, designing for administration and security is the best way to go. If you can create a very complicated sort of a structure here to organize all of your resources, but then it becomes unmanageable. So when you design Active Directory, you'll start with your domain, and then you'll build more if you have a good reason to. Then you'll organize your resources within that domain in OUs based on your support structure, and you'll keep that simple as well. And if you wanted to, you know, if you needed to assign more stringent security, then you could create these other OUs. And the
now,
same.
no, let me stop you here for a minute. For our audience, could you explain what an OU is, just to be sure?
Yeah, for our audience, I think we all understand what, you know, a hard drive is, or volume and folder. Right. And the idea behind an OU is similar. That we have, let's say, 10,000 user accounts, some in New York and some in Los Angeles. You could create an organizational unit. You could think of it as a directory, and then store your Los Angeles accounts in one and your New York accounts in another, and then you can delegate the administration of the two. So you have two admin groups that are responsible for those resources.
So it's a similar to like a directory folder structure in a sense.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, good.
For the same kind of reasons too, you know, you can assign security in an OU. It's inherited with the child objects, the same as you would assign permissions at a folder, and those permissions are inherited at the child folders as well.
Okay.
So that's one thing about Active Directory that's kind of simple model. So, you know, enough of a design where you can delegate administration and organize your resources, but not so many that you have to dig deeper and deeper and deeper into, you know, like going into subdirectory after subdirectory after subdirectory. So relatively flat model, probably going no deeper than maybe 3 levels of OUs, maybe 4, but nothing deeper than that.
It sounds like that you've run into a few that go deeper than 3 or 4 levels in your past. Is that true? That you've which might be good for a non-security situation, but when you're really getting security into the rules, it makes the security tools have a hard time following that. Is that what I'm understanding here?
Yeah, I would imagine yes, and even to kind of take a little bit of a turn here, but something I think is relevant. Even more so, I think, when we're managing access to resources, and we have a whole, you know, group of users that need access to the same resources. And to make that simple for us, we create groups of users, like by department. Your sales group would need access to a sales database, for instance. In the Microsoft environment, you can add users to a group, but you can also take a group and add a group to another group. And we call this group nesting. So a good example of this is accounting. Andrew, you're a CPA. I didn't know that, by the way. So you could have an accounting group, and then if you had accounts receivable and accounts payable, you could create 2 groups for those, because they would need access to different resources. But you could also put them in the accounting group, because that would be an appropriate membership for them. But what we also sometimes see is that then within accounts receivable, somebody decides that they're going to create another group that's, you know, the New York office versus the LA office, and then managers, and then those get really these deep kind of nesting structures as well. And that becomes, I think, even more problematic for our security tools than the OUs, because then it becomes difficult to identify all of the users that are in these different groups, and it just becomes more and more complicated to manage the whole thing.
That kind of leads me into a next question, kind of a follow-up question I want to ask you. So we talked about some of the good designs, keeping it to like a 3 or 4 level at most, right? as far as subdirectories and things like that. So what you've mentioned nesting, and maybe you could expand on what nesting is a little bit, but also what are some other bad designs that you've seen with Active Directory, other things that would not facilitate an identity and security project, the kinds we're talking about here?
Well, I think most of the time that we see, we look at designs, initially we see some really good designs. And over time, we get this drift. We get administrators that make changes and they don't understand why the Active Directory is structured the way it's structured. They're not inside the mind of the previous administrator. And then there's the next one and the next one and the next one. And one of the big issues going back to the initial design is when you're naming objects, you should have a consistent naming convention for your user accounts and your computer accounts, and you should have consistent attributes when you name departments and things like that. All of that should be consistent, and it should be easy to identify those resources, what those accounts are attached to. That would be one thing. It also is really important, I think, to come up with a good naming convention for the groups as well. In Active Directory, in the domain side, the way that we tend to use groups is to group users who are going to access the resources. So a good way to name, salespeople, for instance, would be a good name for a group that is going to, be your salespeople. Or if you're creating a group specifically for a project, then a good naming convention, project, a redesign project group or whatever. So good, consistent naming conventions. And then on top of that, all of this should be documented. Why did you create the group? Who's in the group? So how's it being used? Because what we find a lot is you go and you'll see that there are user accounts for users that are no longer in the organization, that we find groups that are no longer, especially for projects and things like that, we find groups that are no longer being used anymore. And then you come up with, you'll find, hundreds or thousands of groups, and then it becomes really unmanageable again. So identifying, simply and clearly identifying the resources, I think, is one part of good design. And ongoing, just managing those resources, trimming that database, getting rid of the user accounts that are no longer valid, looking at the groups that you have in place and getting rid of those groups that are no longer valid. And then there's another type of group, and I think this is really important, especially for what we're talking about today. The computers, the servers that are hosting your applications in a Microsoft environment, we would create on those computers, this is not on a domain controller, this is on another computer where maybe you're hosting a database, we would create groups there and assign the permissions to the applications that are hosting those, the applications that are being hosted on that machine, and then add the groups to that, what we call a local group, to get the permissions. And those need to be documented as well, because that's at the location of the resource, and that's defining who's actually getting the access to the resource. So you should really know what the local groups you have out there as well and what they're being used for. And those should be named in such a way that it's very obvious. HRDB read, would be something that would tell you this is an HR database and the members of this group have read access. So that sort of thing is mostly, I think, what we see as an issue here.
As far as poor design. Hey, Andrew, I'm gonna let you jump in on this poor design discussion, because you're at the other end, right? So if there's some of these poor designs that Joe has kind of mentioned, you've got a few stories, I would bet, of how you've run into a couple of those. You want to share a little bit of that? We've kind of talked about that between us before, so maybe you could share that for our audience too.
Sure. Sometimes I feel like we're Indiana Jones. We got to make sense of all the archaeology of what we find in Active Directory, because of so many administrators that have been there, and each one have their own methodology. They have their own naming convention. They have their own approach to nesting or not nesting. And so what we have to do is kind of uncover, usually without any documentation, what are we really dealing with? And until we really know that, it makes it challenging for tools like we mentioned for identity security to go in, and once you make sense of it, you can create a catalog. Once you have the catalog, now you can know what to request and approve and provision. But until you get then to that point, you're really dealing with a lot of unknowns, and you really need subject matter experts within not only Active Directory, but within, say, the application layer, because those are the folks that know, oh, that AD group really was meant for this application, not for the group of people. It was meant to get into that database. It was meant to get into the application or the file folders. And then once you start unraveling all this mystery, now we can make sense of it. So, it's very important in one respect to have a good naming convention and documentation. But I would say on a challenge from a malicious actor standpoint, you're making it very easy for them if you say, this is where the secret server is. This is the HR database where all the sensitive information is. You don't want to name it so
That's
obvious
right.
that it makes it easy for the
Make the hacker's job easy, right?
That's right. So there's a balance. You got efficiency and the mapping exercise, and you got to balance that with good security practices.
Are you in agreement with Joe that it's about 3 to 4 levels is about all of these security tools want to see? I mean, that's kind of the max of where they need to be. So Joe's suggesting kind of a flat structure to the directory process.
Yeah, and I think that's very much in alignment with Microsoft approach as well.
You guys have both said the word nesting a couple of times. Joe, will you just quickly do a definition just in case somebody in our audience doesn't really follow what that means?
Yeah. So with nesting, the idea here is that you're going to create a group of users that have common, that need access to certain resources, as I said, like accounts receivable. That group of users, and let's say it's 50 people. You can put them in that group, and then that group can go into another group. So the members of accounts receivable will receive the same permissions as the group that they're added to. So in one action, you can add all of those members as a member of another group as well, and we call that nesting.
Okay, so 5 and 6 and 7 layers of that is just too much, right? We got to stop that at a certain point, otherwise it just makes security's job way too difficult, basically.
Yeah.
Too many permutations, basically.
And I would say also that if you've got 5 or 6 or 7 groups nested, you probably have, some of the users are in more than one of those groups. So it just, it
complicates things incredibly. Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, that makes sense. Okay, Andrew, let's get you back into this thing. Okay, so our original premise here is we're going to do one of these identity security projects. But what do we need to do to get ready before we, what's the prep work before someone would want to go ahead and start that? So if someone like Joe was at the customer site that you were going to go do some consulting for, and he had already got an Active Directory put together properly, how would that make your job easier?
Very much. I mean, it could shave it could shave months off of the overall project, because until we really have that good Rosetta Stone to map into the endpoint, the actual item that you're trying to secure and give access to, until we have that mapping, it makes it very difficult for us to provide anything meaningful for the identity security solution.
Okay.
So very much recommend to all of our clients, really take a look at your Active Directory. And of course, everybody's going to say they have an issue or it's messy or sloppy. But I think it just comes down to, find documentation if you can, find the subject matter experts if not, and then do your own kind of homework internally before you have to pay the dollars to the experts to come in and make sense of it with you.
Okay. Well, last thing I want to do is, this is just our first topic. This is just our initial panel discussion around identity security projects. But Andrew, you're going to be involved in the future ones as well, right? You're going to be involved in the next few ones we do. So could you give us kind of a quick lead in without giving away the whole show, basically? But could you give us a little bit of lead in on a couple of topics around identity and security that we're going to be hitting next time in the next panel discussion?
Sure. So again, everything in security is layers of defense, and we see identity security at the core. And then you start layering on more and more defenses against the bad guys. And the next one would be your privileged access management, basically a methodology and tools and controls to secure the administrative credentials and all the other secrets that you have in the organization in terms of your tools and how you manage those. In addition to that, very common, everybody's used to this by now, you have that multi-factor authentication, meaning you go to your bank website. What's the first thing after the ID and the password? They get that, the bong on your phone, and you have to go fill in some more information. That's a multi-factor authentication, which gives you another layer of security. So we really see all these things kind of working together in an integrated fashion, and that improves not only again, back to the business and security cases, improves your overall security standpoint, and improves the ability to comply with regulatory needs that point to these really core layers of defense, as well as improve your efficiencies. So yeah, look forward to having you all in the next discussion as well.
Yeah, so we're going to hit that. Privileged access management and multi-factor authentication. Probably do some single sign-on with it too, right? A few of those things will all be factored in. So look for future panel discussions from our people here at International Communications Management and all of our alliance partners. It was a privilege today to be with you. I thank so much my panelists, Joe and Andrew, who I think all of you would agree are super experts in the areas that they cover. And we're looking forward to doing a lot of business with all of you out there in the audience. So give us a call and we'll start some conversations. Thank you all for attending. It's been our privilege to talk with you today.